Who do you think said the "I will put you back together" line? The puppet. I don't think it was Afton. Like, I get where the idea of William being the final speaker comes from. Like, there's some things that he says that are, like, the same as the final speaker. Michael saying, like, I put it back together just like you asked me to, and he's saying that to William. And also in the FNaF 3 teaser, there's the line, I'm still here. And both of those things, I will put you back together and I'm still here, those are both things that Fred Bartolci says. So, like, I get that. It kind of depends, because Afton's goal, I've never thought, really, except when I was Mike Victim, but I never really thought that, like, Afton putting the bite victim back together in some way, like turning him into an animatronic or like a robot or something like that. I never really thought that made sense, or like trying to remake him, and that's why he killed kids or whatever. I never thought that was very convincing, especially since I believe that the bite victim is the runaway and Midnight Motorist, which would mean that Charlotte died before him anyway, So Afton still killed kids without that motivation. What do you think FNaF 4 even is now? It breaks down into 3 things. Number 1, the experiments. Afton's experiments. He uses hallucinogenic gas to test the effects of fear on children. One of these children, I think, is the bite victim. So he has to go through those experiences. Probably as a punishment for sneaking out, like in Midnight Motorist. Like he says, he will be sorry when he comes back. That's probably what he has to go through after that. And then after that, after the bite victim gets bitten, when he's in his coma, he has nightmares about those experiences, about that bedroom, but instead of it being the Nightmare animatronics, it's Nightmare himself, Shadow Freddy, essentially feeding off of like the agony of the bite, because we know that Shadow Freddy has like some connections with the bite and the bite victim, specifically with FNaF World having his jaw unhinged, the fact that he's like a Fredbear. He kind of feeds off the fear and the agony and like the, well, not anger really from the, there's not really anger in the bite, but I think he's like probably created based on Afton's anger, and then he feeds on agony and fear and stuff, and more anger. But he feeds on the agony and the fear from the bite, and then he grows stronger, like in Hide and Seek. He grows the sharp teeth and claws. That's what happens with Shadow Bonnie when there's more fear and agony produced. He like feeds on it, and then he grows the sharp teeth and claws. So I think that's what happens with Shadow Freddy after the bite. He feeds on the bite victim's agony and fear from the bite, and then he appears in his nightmares while he's in a coma. That's why there's the ambulance sound from Nightmare's jump scare. Then, later on, sometime after the events of FNaF 1, probably even like around the time of FNaF 3, if you ask me, Michael probably has the bite victim attached to him. This is more like a story idea. Like, it doesn't really have solid evidence or anything. I think it just makes sense story-wise, because with FNaF 3 coming up, like, it's been years since Sister Location, so I feel like Michael probably is, like, his original goal was to seek out Afton, but then I think because he never found him, because Afton was spring-locked, he never found Afton, so he kind of, like, he could have, like, lost his way, if that makes sense. Like, he stopped searching for him, so when FNaF 3 opens, he, like, kind of, like, lost sight of his goal, so he just decided not to go. So then maybe that's when the bite victim appears to him, showing him the nightmares and being like, hey, remember, this stuff happened. This is what happened to me. This stuff was important. Also, here's Plush Trap. This is what your dad has become. Is what our dad has become now. You should probably go, man. And then, so like, yeah, he puts Michael in the place that he was once in. The bite victim puts Michael through the nightmares that the bite victim once experienced, so that Michael remembers everything, and so that he goes through all that to like reattach to his original goal, right? Again, that doesn't have solid evidence. I think it just makes sense story-wise. Yeah, that's it. That's what I think FNaF 4 is. What is the real value thing? I never actually knew what that was. Like, I know people talked about it and said it connected to 2017. I haven't seen the evidence, so I could be wrong. But based on what people said, I always interpreted that as the fact that the logbook came out in 2017. So it might not be a lore thing, it might just be a real life thing, but I feel like it makes more sense for FNaF 4 to be like whenever FNaF 3 is. Could be 2017. Like, if you're thinking linearly, FNaF 3 is 30 years after Freddy's closed. Makes sense for that to be 30 years after FNaF 1, because that was the last time it closed. And it kind of makes sense for it to be 30 years after the missing children incident location, which would be 1985, so it would be 2015. FNaF 1, don't really know when that is. I'd opt probably for 1989, Some people mentioned like a Godfather Part 3 reference in it, which is like 1990, so maybe it's like 1991 or something. I think now it's probably not in 1993. It could be, but or 92. It could be too. If you want, you could say linearly, like you go from FNaF 1, FNaF 2, FNaF 3. Yes, FNaF 1 is the most recent one, but FNaF 2 was the most recent game, and in that game, Freddy's does close down. So theoretically, it could make sense for FNaF 3 to be 30 years after FNaF 2. Because it just says 30 years after Freddy's closed. So, linearly it makes sense for it to be FNaF 2, because it was the most recent game, and Freddy's closes in that game. So it could be like, FNaF 1, FNaF 2 was a prequel, FNaF 3 is 30 years after the FNaF 2 location closed. That works, I think. So, like, it could be 2017. Like, that works fine. That's probably not what I would opt for, but I think it makes logical sense, you know? I think it was about the price of a Freddy's ticket, the number from the blackboard in the comic being how much that ticket would cost during the time Mike writes it in. I can look it up. I know there's a video on it. I want to watch it. And I don't want to watch the whole thing because it's 30 minutes. Maybe I'll watch the whole thing on my own time. But I'll go right here to real value code.
This second half of the video is my main motivation. So there's a code, for lack of a better word, in the logbook that you've probably never heard of. It's something that, to my knowledge, has been almost entirely ignored. I, however, will not stand for real value code erasure. What's the real value code? Well, on page 79, there's a $16 coupon in which Mike writes, "For real value, see page 61. Page 61 is the comic strip with Freddy and Foxy, which has the whiteboard with the numbers 5 plus 4 and 3. If this sounds familiar, it's because this was used in the Cassidy code. Though mistakenly not put in the first printing, the words "my name" appear on page 79, and when redirected to page 61, the numbers 5 plus 4, or 9, and 3 give the coordinates for the I in Cassidy. But people all ignore he says to go to page 61 for real value. Real value is an actual term for the value of something adjusted for inflation. So what Michael is saying is to go to page 61 to find the value of the coupon adjusted for inflation at the time he's writing this. The coupon has a value of $16. On page 61, if we add the 5 plus 4, we get 9 and then 3. Multiplication is the only operation that makes sense, so we multiply the numbers to get 27. So the real value of the $16 coupon at the time Michael's writing this is $27. But when is the coupon supposed to have been from? Our best guess is that it's supposed to be from the last year the last Freddy's was open, so 1993. It could technically be some year before 1993, but I'll address that in a minute.
I assume he's like saying
I've used multiple inflation
1993.
calculators online, and by putting the year as 1993 and the value as $16, the only year in which the real value comes to $27 is 2017. 2016 undershoots it and 2018 overshoots, but 2017 is right on the money. So Michael is definitely not filling this out during FNaF 1.
I think the issue is FNaF 1 probably isn't 1993. 1991 is $28.78. $16 in 1991 is $27.84 in 2015. It's hard to dictate because now with more recent knowledge and just like thinking about it more, FNaF 1 doesn't seem to be in 1993. So that being the basis for this theory makes it a little bit hard to like solidly say that. Let's see, what other years do people say like FNaF 1 could be? Like, if we assume FNaF 3 takes place in 2015, 30 years after the MCI, then that lines up with FNaF 1 taking place in 92, which means you get paid on the same day, but in both 1 and 2. Yeah, like 92 works like with the schedule if you go based on FNaF 2. I always thought it would be 1993 because the calendar lines up with Night 5 being a Friday, which I think makes logical sense. But also, I feel like if we say we're looking for consistency, then 92 makes more sense because in both 1992 and 1987, the last paycheck, like it's the same date, and in both, it would be a Thursday that we get paid, I think, right? Let's see. If we go 92 to 2015, 2703. So that works. FNaF 3 can be 2015. That works pretty well. Is Nightmare Shadow Freddy? Yes, he is. Well, first of all, in the files of FNAF 4, Nightmare is referred to as Shadow Freddy, and in Ultimate Custom Night, Nightmare says, "I am your wickedness made of flesh" to Afton, implying he is essentially Afton's evil manifested. Well, in the MCI, Afton lures the missing kids throughout Freddy's to the safe room. In FNAF 3's Follow Me minigames, Shadow Freddy lures the animatronics possessed by the missing kids to the safe room. Throughout Freddy's to the safe room. So it's like Shadow Freddy's kind of repeating history. So it's like Shadow Freddy and Afton are very clearly linked. Nightmare and Afton are... Nightmare is essentially the evil of Afton. Nightmare and Shadow Freddy are supposedly the same character, so it just makes sense. They have the same role. They're named each other, they're said to be the same character. So yeah, they're just the same character. Nightmare has the sound of an ambulance connecting him to the bite, and Shadow Freddy has like an unhinged jaw in FNAF World, implying there's like a connection between him and the bite too. So there's just like a bunch of things that like connects them to different characters. By extension, connects them to each other, because they're both connected to those characters, I guess, if that makes sense. It's kind of like the same with Eleanor. Like theoretically, Shadow Freddy and Eleanor could be the same character, because they're both at least partially made up of the evil of Afton and feed on fear and anger and agony. So it makes sense for them all to be the same character. Nightmare, Shadow Freddy, Nightmare Yawn even, because like he's a version of Nightmare, the replacement of him for the Halloween DLC. So Nightmare, Shadow Freddy, Nightmare Yawn, and Eleanor all being the same character makes a decent amount of sense. But yeah, if FNAF 1 is in 1992, which makes sense because then it accounts for the Godfather Part 3 reference, because it came out in 1990. It accounts for the Sega Genesis because it came out in 1989, and all the other references I believe are before that. And it makes sense with the paycheck in FNAF 1 and 2 being the same date and falling on the same day. And then if FNAF 3 is 2015, then that accounts for the real value. So that makes sense. I'm going to continue watching the video.
Place in 2023, but instead 2017, or very possibly 2015. I know this contradicts a years-long consensus, but let me explain myself. The real value code is a legitimate code in the logbook. I've seen some people dismiss it because, oh, we already used that page for the Cassidy code, like it couldn't be used for multiple things. But that take completely ignores the fact that even though those pages were used for another code, Michael still tells us to look at page 62 to find the real value of the $16 coupon. This code is intended to show us the year Michael filled out this book. I don't think that should be disputed. That year then also has to be the year FNAF 3 takes place. The only other quote-unquote...
Yeah, I'd say it does make a lot of sense because... Michael's the logbooks are meant to be, because they're in FNAF 3, they're very clearly meant to be like an homage to the original logbooks, like from like the original Freddy's days. Everything is like copied over, but probably just like the Freddy's location in the background is changed to FNAF 3 so that like the FNAF 3 people can actually like have it be associated with them. Because FNAF 3 is all about revisiting the past, basically. It's all about having all the stuff from the original Freddy's locations in an amusement park, a horror attraction dedicated to those Freddy's locations. So having an authentic logbook from that time makes a lot of sense. So they would copy over all the fun facts, the quizzes, the numbers, everything like that. But now Michael is filling this out in FNAF 3. Maybe the FNAF 3 people didn't account for the actual value, or they just didn't care because it was meant to be authentic. And then Michael was like, oh yeah, but this is also not the original one, so this is the real value. You can find it here on this page. So I think that makes a lot of sense, just for it to like add up properly. Like I think it makes sense for Michael to write that, just because he's filling out an authentic logbook based on 1992 logbooks, but in 2015. I think that makes sense. I'm not 100% sure if FNAF 3 would be 2015. Like, I could definitely see it. I still kind of find the idea of it slightly weird that it's not 30 years after FNAF 1, just because it's like 30 years after Freddy's closed. And yes, it closed in 1985 and 1987, but like it closed for the last time when FNAF 1. at the end of FNaF 1. I don't know, like, it works. It just doesn't work as flawlessly, I guess, but it still works, so it's not a huge deal.
The only other quote-unquote argument I've seen against this is a hand wave and dismissal. Oh gosh, not that. And then ignoring it. So let's start with acknowledging the fact that this exists and is a thing. Next is to realize that even if I'm solving the code all wrong with the multiplication or the coupon 0 or whatever else, it is literally impossible for the logbook to give a year any later than 2017. Why? Because the logbook was released in late December 2017, and the code relies on knowing the inflation rate. It's not possible for the answer to somehow come out to be 2023, because neither Scott nor the designer of the book could possibly know the inflation rates of 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023.
How funny would it be if Scott was like, okay, I'm gonna do this really clever thing with the inflation rates, and then it turned out to be a prime number? What would he have done? Like, he couldn't use a chalkboard and math to do it. He would have to be like, he would have to do addition rather than multiplication, because if it's a prime number, it wouldn't work at all.
Why the year 2017, though? After all, FNaF 3's description says that the game takes place, quote, 30 years after Freddy Fazbear's Pizza closed its doors.
2017 works, because, like I said, it makes logical sense, like, in order. Like FNaF 1, FNaF 2, FNaF 3. FNaF 1, 1992, question mark. FNaF 2, 1987. In FNaF 2, Freddy's closes. FNaF 3, 30 years after Freddy's closes. So, in a linear sense, it makes sense to be 30 years after FNaF 2. 2017
does check out as still being 30 years after, quote, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza closed its doors.
Yeah.
It being 30 years after FNaF 2. But wouldn't it make the most sense for it to be referring to the last and final closing of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza? Yes, it absolutely would make more sense. I'm not denying that. Despite that,
it would make more sense, but it's not the only thing that makes sense.
FNaF 1 location closing. Why would Scott make the 30 years in reference to the FNaF 2 locations closing? The only reason I can think of is that, at the time, this was the only Freddy Fazbear's Pizza closing that had a definitive date attached to it.
Fair enough.
The most recent one in terms of game release.
Yeah,
and we
exactly.
actually see the FNaF 2 location shut down at the end of the game, unlike in FNaF 1, where it's only stated that the pizzeria will shut down by the end of the year, and only in an Easter egg news clipping. It might have just been the closing on the forefront of Scott's mind. But there's also a chance that FNaF 3 is yet a different year, 2015. The real value code only gives the year 2017 if you place the coupon in 1993, the theorized year of FNaF 1. But FNaF 1 might actually take place in 1992 instead. I know this is a lot of timeline shifting I'm proposing, but stick with me. 1993 has been generally agreed upon as the year of FNaF 1 ever since MatPat made his first FNaF 1 theory 9 years ago, where he matched up Mike's hourly wage to the minimum wage of that time. However, the specific year, 1983, was reached under the assumption that the first day of work was a Monday, and that Mike's first paycheck was a Friday, which is a pretty reasonable assumption. But in FNaF 2, which has a definitive year, the first workday is a Sunday, and Mike's first paycheck is on a Thursday. If we assume that it was the same for FNaF 1, that puts the game 1 year back in 1992. And the value of $16 in 1992 comes out to be $27 in the year 2015.
Yes.
Which happens to be exactly 30 years after the MCI and the subsequent closing of all Freddy Fazbear's Pizza locations. But why is this so important? Sure, it's kind of interesting, but it doesn't seem like something that would affect the lore that much. Well, there's been a lot of debate recently over the timeline of the Pizzaplex saga after we learned from Tales from the Pizzaplex that the timeline is actually a lot tighter than we initially thought. People have gone from suggesting that security breach happened in the 2040s or 50s or even later,
to be fair,
to the most popular years now being 20...
Now, Tales isn't in the games, so this stuff doesn't really matter, but I do want to skip to this part. Yeah, I know FNaF 6 exists. I want to check what that's about.
Lastly, there is one other hiccup, however, and there's a good chance you've been waiting for me to bring this up. There's still Pizzeria Simulator, which people place in 2023 because of the HRY 223 recording, and this theory would require that it not be in 2023. Because if FNaF 3 is 2015, but Pizza Sim is still 2023, that doesn't really help that much, does it? Really though, I've never been totally convinced that 223 is supposed to mean 2023, because that's just not how you abbreviate a year. You don't leave out a digit in the middle. If the number means anything, it would make more sense for it to be a date, 223, February 23rd. Or, maybe not.
To be fair, I think that I've always been convinced by the 223. I've always only ignored it recently because I had to believe that it was in 2015 because of Tales games, but obviously that's not true anymore. So that doesn't really matter. But I think that FNaF 6, that being the year, I've always thought that was the case. It being a date, I mean, it could be, but I feel like because it lines up timeline-wise, like, to be in 2023, like, especially before, like, all the Tales stuff, like, with FNaF 3 being in, like, 2015, or even theoretically being in 2023, as some people suggested, I think having that knowledge, Scott intentionally would have put 223 to clarify that this game was in 2023, because why else would he do that specific number? It being February 23rd doesn't really matter that much. I would also say that it does perfectly make sense to be a date, because sure, you don't abbreviate dates like that, but you also don't abbreviate Henry as HRY, because you just left out the N. Like, you're not keeping it locked in as the full name. Like, you could easily read that as Harry. Like, there's no definitive thing saying that that's the name Henry, but we know that it is. So 223 meaning 2023, it's not that far-fetched.
I want to give an honorable mention to another theory that explains the logbook in a different way. It's called meta logbook. Basically, the theory is that the logbook isn't strictly canon. It doesn't have a place in the timeline and isn't meant to be interpreted literally. It's just a cobbled together activity book that contains meta clues to help theorists solve the lore. In other words, people find the logbook too hard to explain, so they decide that it actually doesn't need explaining at all, despite the fact that it's perfectly possible to come up with an explanation for the logbook that perfectly fits with the games. It's pretty much the ultimate cop-out theory, a way for theorists to have their cake and eat it too. They want to take the lore hints they like, but don't want to deal with all the other implications of the logbook they don't like. So they don't have to shift their understanding of FNaF 3. Michael drawing Nightmare Fredbear? Yeah, that means he's the FNaF 4 player. Michael evidently getting this book from Fazbear's Fright? Well, that's clearly just a non-canon quirk of the logbook. The Cassidy code telling us the name of Golden Freddy? Of course, it's a clear lore hint. The real value hint that Michael writes, however? Okay, I actually have no idea how meta logbookers explain the real value thing. In fact, the real value code pretty much single-handedly disproves this theory, because it's an intentional lore hint no matter what, which means the year that Michael fills out the logbook is important. And that can't be important without it being canon that Michael actually does fill out the logbook.
What I'll say is that meta logbook is kind of a cherry-picking theory, but I think that it kind of makes sense if you're saying that Michael filled out the logbook, the Faded and Ultra Text are communicating, but those are two separate events. So if you say, like, the logbook is a real thing, Michael actually fills out the logbook, but the conversation that's happening within the logbook, that's not actually happening in the logbook is just, like, a medium to display it. It's kind of like in Sister Location, or like in the source code of the two Scott websites back in like the FNaF 6 days or whatever, how it was like the conversation between Baby and Ennard, and like how they booted Baby out of the Ennard tribe, as MatPat put it. That's what that was all about, but that didn't literally happen in the source code, right? So like you could say the same with the logbook. It's not the conversation is a real conversation. The logbook is a real logbook that Michael fills out, but the conversation within the logbook is not actually happening within the logbook canonically. The logbook is just a medium to show us that conversation outside of just saying it in the games or whatever, if that makes sense, So like I can get behind that. I'm not saying I necessarily believe that. I don't really have an opinion on that. But I don't think that the logbook as a whole is just meta. Like, I think the conclusions like that, real value page, like, that's a real thing that Michael wrote in the logbook. But the conversation in the logbook between, theoretically, Cassidy and the bite victim, That's not what's happening in the logbook. That's just another conversation that the logbook is showing us for lore reasons, you know? That's what I say makes sense. Not saying I necessarily believe it or that I necessarily don't believe it. I'm just saying that makes sense, but saying the logbook as a whole is completely meta and entirely isn't in universe, is just for lore hints, that, nah. I think Nessie 97 is a lot more compelling as a year than 2023 personally. I would not agree, because like I said before, HRY223 just overall isn't good with abbreviations. HRY definitely doesn't make sense to be Henry. We just know that it is because we know Henry exists as a character. 223 meaning 2023, I think that makes sense. Nessie 97, I think in concept it makes more sense to be a year, but in context it doesn't, because Vanessa's birthday is in September. So the 9 being September and then the 7 just being like the day in September does make sense. I think it just kind of depends on like what your timeline stance is, but the timeline doesn't need to be squeezed together so much now that Tails isn't in the games. So there's no reason that it can't be in 2023 and still leave room for like security breach and all that to be later on in like 2035 theoretically. FNaF 4 and David's bedroom are similar, but they're not the same. Well, yeah, obviously, like there's very clear differences between them, but there's also very clear similarities. You can tell David's bedroom is intended to be the FNaF 4 bedroom. Or not be it, but like look like it. So it's clear that David's bedroom is what the FNaF 4 bedroom was based on. Who do you think the Golden Freddy kid in Happiest Day is? It's tough to say, because I think it's a little bit complicated in a way, because some people say it's the bite victim, some people say it's Cassidy. I would personally say that it's probably the bite victim, but it was supposed to be Cassidy, if that makes sense. So all of Happiest Day is based on the bite victim's memories. All the pieces of Happiest Day, all the actual Happiest Day itself, every minigame leading up to and including Happiest Day is a memory of the bite victim turned into its own thing. So knowing that, it makes a lot of sense that the bite victim set up Happiest Day and Cassidy was supposed to be set free in it, but that she decided to stay because it was the bite victim's party. And that actually makes a lot of sense if you consider like the logbook and the line "the party was for you." What if that actually means, more specifically, the party wasn't for me? So you're trying to make me the receiver, but I shouldn't be the receiver because it was your party. You should be the receiver. So either she stays behind or she's just set free as a separate character. Because there's 16 balloons in there. There's a bunch of people that are probably there. Like, you could say Michael, Elizabeth are probably there. Maybe even Andrew if he exists. But, like, they could all be in Happiest Day. You could say Cassidy's still there, too. Just not as the receiver, I guess, if that makes sense. This is going to sound wild, but I think the Golden Freddy kid is Cassidy and Crying Child is the puppet in Happiest Day. I've actually heard people say that before. I don't agree with that, but I've heard of that take before, yeah. I mean, I don't think that he's the player, but I do agree that he's using his memories to free the MCI kids. I don't think that means he's not a part of it. I think it just means, like, his original plan was to free all the missing kids, and then Cassidy was like, I shouldn't receive this party, you should, because it's yours. Isn't Cassidy the princess? A lot of people say no now because of how they removed the name Cassidy from the files of Security Breach for the princess. I, though, personally still think that the princess is Cassidy. First of all, this is not a reason I believe it, but it does make it a lot more convenient to believe that the princess is Cassidy because there's not really any solid design for Cassidy that I can use for video, so using the princess is very convenient. But the three main reasons I believe that Cassidy is the princess. One, she's golden, and Cassidy's Golden Freddy, so it makes sense. Two, there's also the It's Me in the files of Security Breach's Princess Quest, which is a line attributed to Golden Freddy. And three, the end of Princess Quest 2 has Cassidy enter a room with Old Man Consequences, and he says it's time to sleep, aka time to rest. In an Ultimate Custom Night, Ultimate Custom Night tells Cassidy, rest your own soul. So I interpret that as being like kind of parallels of the same event. It's Old Man Consequences telling Cassidy to rest in both cases. So I think it just makes more sense for Cassidy to be the princess. And with, like, the logbook, she's, like, trying to help the bite victim remember things. Oh, also, there's also a FNaF World, where if that Ultimate Custom Night Old Man Consequences minigame has Cassidy as the player, then in FNaF world, theoretically, Cassidy could also be the player of that game. Because that Old Man Consequences minigame is also in that. So it would be weird for that red Freddy character to be two different characters, even though it's the same minigame in both cases. So I feel like it would make sense if Cassidy was the player of FNaF World, if that makes sense, and like have her be trying to help the puppet set the bite victim free. I'm not sure about that. I also have ideas that the player of FNaF World could be like Shadow Bonnie or something, like as a helpful spirit for the puppet, because I think that Shadow Bonnie was created from the agony of Charlotte's death. But theoretically, if Cassidy was the player of FNaF World, then she would be helping Charlie put the pieces of Happiest Day together so that the bite victim can find them and actually fully put them together. So then in that case, those two things, they kind of imply Cassidy to be a very helpful spirit. Like, she seems vengeful in some cases, but I feel like her nature is to mostly be a helpful spirit, to help the other spirits along with Charlotte, for her and Charlotte to help guide the other spirits in a way. And that's probably kind of why she's like more separate from the others as well. She's a missing kid and she's grouped in with them, but she's also kind of separate in a way. Oh, also, what I mentioned in my Andrew theory was that she seems to be trying to help Andrew stop torturing Afton. So it's like she's trying to help the spirits. So knowing that, her being the princess also makes a lot of sense because she's trying to help Vanessa escape Glitch Trap. Overall, I think a lot of evidence outside of just the original file name implies that Cassidy probably was the princess and probably still is. I get people being like, the file name was removed, so she might just not be anymore. And I get that. I feel like it doesn't make sense that Vanessa would be the princess, because in FNaF VR, we have the scene of her being locked behind the door. And then in Princess Quest, we have the scene of the princess opening that door and freeing Vanessa. It would be weird if it was Vanessa freeing Vanessa. You know what I mean? So I think it just makes more sense for Cassidy to be the princess in that, for all those reasons. Fear the Glitch Trap is Afton the Mimic. There's no point in it being the Mimic then, if it's just his spirit anyway.